The murky waters of Blackwood River swirled around Vivian Calloway's skirts as she waded deeper, each step more determined than the last. The year was 1876, and Vivian had decided that the unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming Territory would claim one more soul before the day was done. Behind her, the small town of Riverton continued its daily bustle, unaware that one of its residents was surrendering to the powerful current just beyond the bend. Vivian's pale fingers trembled as she pushed further into the river, the icy water now reaching her waist. The letter from back east had been the final blow. Her family home seized, her younger brother dead from consumption, and no place left to return to. 3 years in this dusty frontier town had yielded nothing but broken promises and dashed hopes. The boarding house where she worked barely provided enough to survive, and the lingering glances of the owner's son had recently turned to unwanted advances. "What's the point?" she whispered to the uncaring water. Her voice was lost in the sound of rushing currents. The heavy wool of her dress pulled her downward as she took another step forward, the riverbed suddenly dropping away beneath her feet. Vivian gasped as the cold water engulfed her, the current immediately taking hold. For one terrifying moment, her survival instinct screamed for her to fight, but she forced herself to relax, to let the water take her. She closed her eyes against the burn of the river, lungs aching as she held her breath. Perhaps this was mercy quicker than starvation, kinder than the life that awaited her. The roar of the river filled her ears, drowning out all other sounds, including the thundering hoofbeats approaching the riverbank. Vaughn Daniels had been tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his cattle when he spotted the figure entering the river. At first, he thought it might be someone fishing or perhaps crossing at the shallow point, but something about the deliberate, slow progression had caught his attention. When the figure disappeared beneath the surface and didn't immediately resurface, his instincts took over. He urged his horse toward the riverbank, dismounting in one fluid motion. Without hesitation, he shed his gun belt and leather vest, plunging into the frigid water. The current was strong, but Vaughn was stronger, his powerful strokes cutting through the water as he searched for any sign of the person he'd seen. A flash of fabric caught his eye, and he dove toward it, his hand closing around something solid. He pulled hard, fighting against the current until he broke the surface with a gasping woman in his arms. Her face was pale, lips blue from cold and lack of oxygen, but she was alive. He could feel her chest moving against his as he struggled back toward the shore. By the time he dragged them both onto the muddy bank, the woman was coughing up water, her body shuddering violently. Vaughn turned her onto her side, ensuring her airway was clear, before grabbing the blanket from his saddle. "You're all right now," he said, wrapping the blanket around her trembling shoulders. "I've got you." Vivian's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to despair as she realized what had happened. She hadn't succeeded. The cold had nearly numbed her completely, but it couldn't numb the crushing disappointment. "Why?" she croaked, her voice raw. "Why did you save you?" Vaughn finished for her, his voice gentle but firm. He brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. "Because you're done with that. Whatever drove you into that river, you're done with it." Vivian tried to protest, but a violent shiver overtook her body instead. Without another word, Vaughn lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse. She was too weak to resist as he mounted behind her, holding her securely against his chest as they rode away from the river. "My name's Vaughn Daniels," he said, his voice rumbling against her back. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles from here. We'll get you warm and dry, and then we can talk about what happens next." Vivian closed her eyes, too exhausted to argue. "Vivian," she murmured, her consciousness fading. "Vivian Calloway." Vaughn tightened his arm around her waist. "Stay with me, Vivian Calloway. I didn't pull you from that river just to lose you now." As they rode toward the distant outline of Vaughn's ranch, neither could have imagined how their lives had just irrevocably changed course like the river itself, finding an unexpected new path through the wild terrain of the Wyoming Territory. The Daniels Ranch came into view as they crested a small hill, a sturdy 2-story house flanked by a barn, corral, and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth that Vivian desperately needed. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, and despite the blanket and Vaughn's body heat, she couldn't stop shaking. As they approached the house, a middle-aged woman emerged from the front door, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. Vaughn. "What in heaven's name found her in the river, Martha?" Vaughn called out, already dismounting and carefully lifting Vivian down. "She needs dry clothes and a warm bed." Martha nodded briskly, her initial shock giving way to efficient action. "Bring her inside, I'll heat water for a bath." Vivian tried to stand on her own but found her legs unwilling to support her weight. Vaughn caught her before she could fall, lifting her once more into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "I'm sure you can, Miss Calloway, just not today," Vaughn replied, carrying her into the house. The warmth from the hearth hit her like a physical force, and Vivian found herself leaning into Vaughn's chest despite herself. Martha had already disappeared upstairs, and Vaughn followed, taking the steps 2 at a time. He brought Vivian to a small but comfortable bedroom, setting her gently on the edge of the bed. "Martha will help you get changed," he said, stepping back. "She's been running this house since my parents passed 5 years ago. You're in good hands." Vivian nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Now that the immediate danger had passed, shame was creeping in. What kind of person tried to end their life, only to be rescued by a stranger? What must he think of her? As if reading her thoughts, Vaughn crouched down in front of her, gently lifting her chin until she was forced to look at him. His eyes were the color of the Wyoming sky at dusk, a deep, steady blue that somehow managed to be both kind and unyielding. "Whatever demons drove you to that river today, they don't get to win," he said quietly. "Not on my watch." Before Vivian could respond, Martha returned with an armful of clothing and a determined expression. "Out with you now, Vaughn," she ordered. "Go tend to your horse and get yourself changed." "You're dripping all over my clean floors." Vaughn stood, giving Vivian one last look before leaving the room. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." The door closed behind him, and Martha immediately set to work, helping Vivian out of her sodden garments with efficient, motherly hands. "That man," Martha muttered as she helped Vivian into a clean nightgown that was slightly too large. "Always bringing home strays, injured wolf pups, orphaned calves, and now," she stopped herself, offering Vivian an apologetic smile. "I don't mean any offense, miss." "None taken," Vivian whispered, her voice still raw from the river water. "I suppose that's what I am now, a stray." Martha's expression softened. "Well, you found yourself in good hands. The Daniels men have always had big hearts, and Vaughn's no exception." She helped Vivian into the bed, tucking the quilts around her. "Now, I'm going to bring you some warm broth, and I don't want to hear a word of protest. You need to get your strength back." Left alone in the unfamiliar room, Vivian stared at the ceiling beams, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she'd been ready to die. Now she was tucked into a stranger's bed, being cared for like she mattered. She closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her before Martha could even return with the promised broth. Vivian woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, she felt nothing but confusion, but then the memories rushed back: the river, the cold, the strong arms that had pulled her from the water. She sat up slowly, her body aching as if she'd been trampled by horses. A soft knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance. The housekeeper carried a tray with a steaming bowl and a cup of coffee. "Good morning," Martha said, her voice gentler than it had been the previous evening. "Thought you might be hungry." Vivian realized she was, in fact, ravenous. "Thank you," she said, accepting the tray. The simple oatmeal and coffee smelled like heaven. "Vaughn's been up since dawn," Martha informed her as Vivian ate. "He's got a ranch to run, but he wanted me to tell you to join him for dinner this evening. Said you two have things to discuss." Martha paused, studying Vivian's face. "He also said there's no rush for you to leave. You're welcome to stay until you're well." "That's very kind," Vivian murmured, "but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition if it's freely offered," Martha interrupted firmly. "Besides, where would you go? Back to that river?" Vivian flinched at the blunt question. Martha sighed, her expression softening. "Forgive an old woman's sharp tongue. It's not my place to judge, but Vaughn's a good man, and if he thinks you're worth saving, then that's good enough for me." After Martha left, Vivian slowly got out of bed, testing her strength. The borrowed nightgown fell past her knees, and someone had left a simple blue dress draped over a chair. The dress was slightly too large, but clean and well-made. Vivian dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons. She found her way downstairs, following the sounds of activity to a large, sun-filled kitchen. Martha was kneading bread dough at a flour-dusted table. "There you are," Martha said, looking up, feeling better. "Yes, thank you," Vivian replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Is there anything I can do to help? I'm not used to sitting idle." Martha studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a basket of green beans. "Those need snapping for dinner, if you're truly feeling up to it." Vivian settled at the table and began working on the beans, finding comfort in the simple, repetitive task. Through the kitchen window, she could see the ranch yard, where Vaughn was visible working with a young horse in the corral. He moved with confidence, his body language calm yet authoritative as he guided the nervous animal. "He has a way with wild things," Martha commented, following Vivian's gaze. "Always has." Vivian quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught watching. "How long has he had this ranch?" "It was his father's before him. Vaughn was born right upstairs in this house," Martha said, turning her attention back to her bread dough. "James Daniels was one of the first to settle this valley. Built everything you see with his own 2 hands, with help from Vaughn as soon as the boy was old enough to hold a hammer. And his mother, Elaine, passed when Vaughn was 16. Influenza. James followed 5 years later, thrown from a horse." Martha pressed the dough into a bowl and covered it with a cloth. "Vaughn's been running things ever since, does a fine job of it too, though it hasn't been easy. He seems capable," Vivian offered, not knowing what else to say. Martha laughed. "That he is. Stubborn as a mule sometimes, but he's got a good head on his shoulders." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Now, tell me about yourself, Miss Calloway. Where are you from?" Vivian tensed, her fingers stilling on the beans. "Back east, Boston, originally." "That's a long way to travel." "What brought you out west?" "Hope, I suppose," Vivian said softly. "Though it seems I left it somewhere along the trail." Martha's eyes softened with understanding. "Hope's a funny thing, has a way of showing up again when you least expect it." She changed the subject, sensing Vivian's discomfort. "When you're done with those beans, would you mind collecting eggs from the henhouse? The fresh air might do you good." Grateful for the reprieve, Vivian nodded. The simple domestic tasks helped ground her, giving her something to focus on besides the hollow feeling in her chest. Throughout the day, she caught herself glancing out the window whenever Vaughn passed by. Each time, she quickly looked away, but not before noticing how his presence seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. By late afternoon, Vivian had helped Martha prepare a hearty dinner of roast beef, vegetables from the garden, and fresh bread. The routine of cooking something she'd done countless times at the boarding house was soothing, allowing her to momentarily forget her circumstances. When Vaughn came in from the fields, he removed his hat and washed up at the pump outside before entering the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his face when he saw Vivian setting the table. "Miss Calloway," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "You're up and about." "I hope you don't mind," Vivian said, suddenly self-conscious. "Martha allowed me to help with dinner." "Mind, not at all." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Vivian's breath catch. "It's good to see you on your feet." Martha bustled between them, placing a steaming platter on the table. "If you two are done staring at each other, dinner's ready," Vaughn chuckled, moving to pull out a chair for Vivian. The gesture was unexpectedly gentlemanly, reminding her that despite his rough exterior, he'd been raised with manners. Dinner was a quiet affair at first, with Vaughn asking polite questions about whether Vivian had slept well and if she was feeling recovered. She answered in kind, maintaining a careful distance in her responses. Finally, after Martha had served apple pie and coffee and then discreetly retired to her room upstairs, Vaughn leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes intent on Vivian's face. "I think it's time we talked about what happened yesterday," he said quietly. Vivian stared into her coffee cup, watching the steam rise. I don't know what to say. You could start with why, Vaughn suggested. His voice held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Vivian took a deep breath. My life, it hasn't gone as planned. Few do, Vaughn observed. I came west 3 years ago after my father died, Vivian continued, surprising herself with her honesty. There was nothing left for me in Boston, no family, no fortune, no prospects. I'd read about the frontier, about the opportunities here. She gave a bitter laugh. I was naive. What happened? Reality happened. I found work at a boarding house in Riverton. The pay was minimal, the work exhausting, and lately. She hesitated, then continued. The owner's son has been making unwelcome advances. Yesterday, I received word that my younger brother, who had stayed with relatives, had died of consumption. The family home has been seized for debts. I have nowhere to return to, even if I could afford the journey. She lifted her eyes to meet Vaughn's. So you see, Mr. Daniels, yesterday wasn't a moment of madness. It was a rational conclusion to a series of unfortunate events. Vaughn was quiet for a long moment. I disagree, he finally said. Vivian blinked in surprise. I beg your pardon. I said I disagree, Vaughn repeated, his voice gentle but firm. There's nothing rational about giving up, Miss Calloway, not when there's breath in your body and strength in your hands. He leaned forward. I've seen men lose everything in a single night of cards and rebuild their fortunes. I've seen women buried husbands and children yet find reasons to rise each morning. Life on the frontier is hard, yes, but it's also full of possibilities. Easy for you to say, Vivian retorted, a spark of anger flaring. You have all this. She gestured around at the comfortable kitchen, the solid house. I do now, Vaughn acknowledged. But 2 years ago, this place was nearly lost. Drought killed half my cattle, rustlers took most of the rest, and the bank was ready to foreclose. His eyes held hers. I didn't give up then. I worked harder, found solutions, and here I am. Vivian looked away, unwilling to admit the impact of his words. I have a proposal for you, Vaughn said after a moment. Vivian's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing. Vaughn laughed. Not that kind of proposal, Miss Calloway, at least not yet. His eyes twinkled with amusement. Martha's getting older and she needs help running the house. The ranch is prospering now and I've been thinking of hiring someone. The position comes with room and board plus a fair wage. You're offering me a job out of pity. I don't do pity, Vaughn said flatly. I'm offering you a job because I need help and you need work. It's a practical arrangement. He paused. Unless you're eager to return to that boarding house in Riverton, Vivian considered his offer. The Daniels ranch was clean, well-run, and far from the unwanted attentions she'd been facing. Martha seemed kind enough, if a bit blunt, and the work would be similar to what she was accustomed to. And then there was Vaughn himself, a man who had saved her life and was now offering her a chance to rebuild it. I'll accept, she said finally. On a trial basis, 1 month, we can both decide if the arrangement is suitable. Vaughn smiled, extending his hand across the table. Deal. Vivian hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip firm but gentle. A strange sensation rippled through her at the contact, not unpleasant, but unsettling in its unfamiliarity. Welcome to the Daniels Ranch, Miss Calloway, Vaughn said, holding her hand perhaps a moment longer than necessary. I have a feeling you're going to fit in just fine. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Vaughn treated Vivian as an employee, not as a charity case. He was fair but exacting, expecting her to pull her weight around the ranch. Martha showed her the routines of the household: when to bake bread, how to manage the pantry inventory, which days were designated for washing, and how to keep the accounts in order. Vivian threw herself into the work, finding unexpected satisfaction in the structured days and physical tasks. The hollow feeling in her chest didn't disappear entirely, but it began to recede, especially on the days when she was too exhausted to dwell on past sorrows. She learned that the ranch employed 3 full-time hands: Hank, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War who managed the cattle; Elias, a young man barely 20 who had a way with horses; and Gabriel, a quiet half-Mexican cowboy who handled the more difficult work of breaking new stock. The men took their meals in the bunkhouse most days, but on Sundays, they all gathered around the main house table for a proper dinner. At first, Vivian kept to herself, speaking only when necessary and avoiding being alone with Vaughn. She was still ashamed of how he'd found her and uncomfortable with the connection that had been forged between them through that moment of weakness. But Vaughn seemed content to give her space, though she often caught him watching her with those thoughtful blue eyes. It was on a bright Tuesday morning in her third week at the ranch that something shifted between them. Vivian was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard a commotion from the corral. Glancing over, she saw Vaughn attempting to calm a terrified bay mare that had somehow gotten tangled in a length of rope. The more the horse struggled, the tighter the rope became around its legs. Without thinking, Vivian dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and hurried over. Vaughn was so focused on keeping the horse from injuring itself that he didn't notice her approach until she was at the fence. "What can I do?" she called. Vaughn glanced up, surprise evident on his face. "Stay back," he warned. "She's panicked." "I can see that," Vivian replied. "But you need an extra set of hands." Before Vaughn could protest further, Vivian climbed through the fence rails and approached slowly, keeping her movements smooth and non-threatening. The mare's eyes rolled wildly, but Vivian began to speak in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, girl. Easy now." "No one's going to hurt you," she murmured, edging closer. To Vaughn, she said quietly, "My father raised thoroughbreds. I know horses." Vaughn nodded, adjusting his strategy. "If you can keep her head still, I can get to the rope." Working together, they managed to calm the mare enough for Vaughn to carefully cut away the tangled rope. When the last strand fell away, the horse gave a full-body shudder and then stood quietly, as if exhausted by her ordeal. Vaughn ran a hand down the mare's neck, checking for injuries. "No harm done, thanks to you," he said to Vivian. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" Vivian shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under his admiring gaze. "As I said, my father bred thoroughbreds, before he lost everything to gambling, that is." She stroked the mare's velvet nose. "This one reminds me of a filly we had when I was a girl. She's a beauty," Vaughn agreed. "Just arrived yesterday from a breeder in Kentucky. Cost me a small fortune, but she's got bloodlines that should improve my stock." He studied Vivian with new interest. "Would you like to work with her?" "She needs gentling, and you clearly have a way about you." The offer surprised Vivian. "But I thought I was hired to help in the house." "You were," Vaughn said. "But a ranch this size needs all hands to be versatile. If you have skills with horses, it would be foolish not to use them." He smiled, the expression warming his weathered face. "Unless you'd rather stick to laundry and cooking," Vivian found herself returning his smile. "I'd love to work with her." "Good," Vaughn said. "We'll start tomorrow." As they walked back to the house together, something had changed between them. The invisible wall Vivian had maintained began to crumble, allowing for real conversation. Vaughn told her about his plans for the ranch, how he was experimenting with new breeding techniques to produce cattle better suited to the harsh Wyoming winters. Vivian, in turn, shared stories of her childhood in Boston, of her father's brief glory days as a respected horse breeder before his vices took over. That evening at dinner, Martha noticed the shift immediately. "Well, well," she commented dryly when Vivian and Vaughn continued their animated discussion about horse training. "Seems you two have found common ground." Vaughn's ears reddened slightly, but he nodded. "Miss Calloway has hidden talents. Turns out she knows more about horses than most men I've hired." "Is that so?" Martha raised an eyebrow at Vivian. "Any other skills you've been hiding, girl?" Vivian hesitated, then admitted, "I can read and write in both French and Italian. My mother insisted on a proper education." She glanced at Vaughn. "I also know basic bookkeeping. My father let me manage his breeding records and occasionally his business accounts." Vaughn set down his fork, staring at her with renewed interest. "Now that is useful information. The ranch books are a mess. I've been meaning to organize them properly, but I never seem to find the time." "I'd be happy to look at them," Vivian offered. "It's settled then," Vaughn said. "Horses in the morning, books in the afternoon. Martha, it seems we've found ourselves a Renaissance woman." Martha snorted, but there was fondness in her eyes as she looked between the two of them. "Just don't work her to death. The girl's only just recovered." I'm perfectly well, Vivian insisted, though she was touched by Martha's concern. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about her welfare. That night, as Vivian readied for bed, she caught herself humming a simple, cheerful tune she couldn't quite place. Stopping mid-note, she realized with a start that it was the first time she'd felt anything resembling happiness since receiving that fateful letter beside the Blackwood River. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Happiness meant having something to lose again. The next morning, Vivian rose early, eager to begin working with the mare. She found Vaughn already in the corral, setting up training equipment. "Good morning," he called when he saw her approaching. "I've been thinking about names for this lady. Any suggestions?" Vivian studied the bay mare, taking in her elegant lines and proud carriage. "Phoenix," she said after a moment. For rising from the ashes, Vaughn looked at her thoughtfully. "Phoenix it is." He didn't need to say aloud that the name might apply to more than just the horse. Over the following days, a routine developed. Mornings were spent with Phoenix, teaching the high-spirited mare to accept a saddle and bridle. Afternoons found Vivian at Vaughn's desk in the small study off the main room, sorting through years of haphazard accounting. Evenings were for shared meals and increasingly comfortable conversation. 2 weeks later, Vivian realized with a start that her 1-month trial period had ended without either of them mentioning it. She brought it up at dinner that night. "My month is up," she said, setting down her fork. "I believe we were to decide if the arrangement was working." Vaughn looked genuinely surprised. "Has it been a month already?" He considered for a moment. "Well, from my perspective, the arrangement is more than satisfactory. Phoenix is coming along beautifully, the house is running smoothly, and for the first time in years I actually know exactly how much money the ranch is making." He smiled at her. "Unless you're unhappy here." "No," Vivian said quickly. "I'm not unhappy." It was an understatement. The truth was that the Daniels ranch had become more of a home to her in 1 month than the boarding house had in 3 years. "Then it's settled," Vaughn said. "You'll stay." Martha, who had been quietly eating her stew, looked between them with knowing eyes. "Perhaps we should discuss a proper contract," she suggested. "Terms, wages, expectations all written down," Vaughn nodded. "That's sensible. We can work on it tomorrow." Later that evening, after Martha had retired, Vivian found herself alone with Vaughn on the front porch. The summer night was warm, the sky ablaze with stars. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch horses nickering softly in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets in the tall grass. "Do you ever think about it?" Vaughn asked suddenly. Vivian didn't need to ask what he meant. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Less often now." Vaughn nodded, his profile strong against the starlit sky. "I'm glad." "Why did you do it?" Vivian asked, the question that had lingered between them for weeks finally finding voice. "Save me, I mean." "You didn't know me. I was nothing to you." Vaughn was quiet for so long that Vivian thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "My mother used to say that a life is a terrible thing to waste, that every person has a purpose, even if they can't see it yet." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the dim light. "When I saw you walking into that river, something in me couldn't let that happen, not when I had the power to stop it. And now," Vivian asked softly, "do you regret it?" Vaughn reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers in the darkness. His touch was warm, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Not for a single moment," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Vivian's heart catch. They sat like that, hands linked, until the moon rose high above the ranch. Neither spoke again, but something profound had shifted between them, a new understanding, a bridge across the chasm that had separated them from the moment he'd pulled her from the river. When Vivian finally rose to go inside, Vaughn stood as well, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Good night, Vivian," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, the name feeling right on her lips. As summer gave way to fall, the ranch buzzed with preparations for the coming winter. Hay needed to be cut and stored, cattle moved to lower pastures, supplies stockpiled for the months when snow might make travel to town impossible. Vivian threw herself into the work alongside everyone else, her slender frame growing stronger, her pale skin tanned by the Wyoming sun. The relationship between Vivian and Vaughn continued to evolve, developing into a partnership that surprised them both. He came to rely on her judgment with the horses and her meticulous management of the ranch's finances. She found herself admiring his unwavering work ethic and his fair treatment of everyone from Martha to the newest ranch hand. What had begun as gratitude on her part and responsibility on his transformed into something deeper, though neither seemed ready to name it. There were moments his hand lingering on hers as he passed the salt at dinner, her catching him watching her with an expression that made her blush, the way they seemed to seek each other's company whenever work allowed that hinted at feelings beyond friendship or professional respect. Martha observed it all with quiet amusement, occasionally making comments about young people taking their time that caused both Vivian and Vaughn to find urgent tasks elsewhere. The first real test of their new dynamic came in early October, when a group of cattle rustlers struck one of the outlying pastures. Elias rode in at dawn, his horse lathered, and his face grim with the news that 20 head of prime beef cattle were missing. Vaughn immediately organized a pursuit party, instructing Hank to remain behind with Martha and Vivian to protect the ranch house. "I want to come with you," Vivian said as Vaughn checked his rifle. "I can ride as well as any of your men." "I know you can," Vaughn replied, his expression serious. "But these rustlers are dangerous. They killed a rancher over in Johnson County last month. All the more reason not to go after them with just 3 men," Vivian argued. "4 would hardly make a difference if they're as well armed as reports suggest," Vaughn countered. His voice softened as he added, "I need to know you're safe, Vivian. Please stay here." Something in his tone, a vulnerability she rarely heard from him, made Vivian relent. "Be careful," she said, impulsively reaching up to straighten his collar. "All of you." Vaughn caught her hand, holding it against his chest for a brief moment. "We'll be back before dark," he promised. But they weren't. As the sun dipped below the horizon with no sign of the men, Vivian's anxiety grew. She paced the front porch, her eyes fixed on the trail leading away from the ranch. "Wearing a hole in my porch won't bring them back any sooner," Martha commented, bringing out a shawl for Vivian against the evening chill. "They should have been back by now," Vivian said, accepting the shawl with a distracted thank you. "Something's wrong. Or they're simply following the trail farther than expected," Martha reasoned. "Vaughn Daniels can take care of himself, has been doing so for years before you arrived." "I know that," Vivian said, though the words did little to ease her worry. An hour after full dark, when Vivian was seriously considering saddling a horse and going after them herself despite Hank's protestations, the sound of hoofbeats broke the night's silence. She rushed to the edge of the porch, straining to see in the darkness. 4 riders approached, moving slowly. Relief flooded through Vivian until she realized that one of the men was slumped forward in his saddle. Even in the dim light of the lantern Hank had raised, she could see it was Vaughn. "Vaughn," she cried, running into the yard as the riders reached the house. "What happened?" "Ambush," Gabriel explained tersely as Elias helped ease Vaughn from his saddle. "Boss took a bullet in the shoulder." Vaughn's face was pale with pain and blood loss, but he managed a weak smile when he saw Vivian. "Told you we'd be back," he said, his voice strained. "You idiot," Vivian said, tears threatening as she helped Gabriel support Vaughn's weight. "You absolute fool." "Careful now," Martha instructed as they brought Vaughn inside and laid him on the dining table. "Elias, fetch my medical kit from the pantry. Gabriel, I need hot water and clean towels." Martha had served as the ranch's unofficial doctor since long before Vaughn took over, having learned basic medicine from her grandmother. She cut away Vaughn's bloodied shirt with practiced efficiency, revealing an ugly wound in his left shoulder. "Bullet went through clean," she announced after examining both sides. "That's something, at least." Vivian stood frozen, staring at the blood seeping from Vaughn's shoulder. The sight of him wounded, vulnerable, awakened something fierce and protective within her. She had already lost so much in her life, she couldn't bear to lose him too. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Hold his hand," Martha instructed. "This is going to hurt, and I need him still." Vivian moved to Vaughn's side, taking his right hand in both of hers. His fingers tightened around hers as Martha began cleaning the wound. "Tell me what happened," Vivian said, trying to distract him from the pain. Through gritted teeth, Vaughn explained how they had tracked the rustlers to a canyon about 15 miles from the ranch. "We were closing in when they spotted us, had a man watching their back trail." He winced as Martha probed the wound. "They opened fire from the rocks. We returned fire, drove them off, but they left the cattle scattered. Gabriel and I got the herd together while Elias tended to the boss," added Hank, who had followed them inside. "Rustlers ran off when they realized we weren't backing down. Brave or foolish?" Vivian asked Vaughn, her voice gentle despite the criticism. "Bit of both, I reckon," Vaughn admitted with a pained smile. Martha finished cleaning the wound and began preparing to stitch it closed. "Vivian, in the left cupboard you'll find a bottle of whiskey. Bring it here." Vaughn took a long swallow of the whiskey when it was offered, then nodded for Martha to proceed. As she worked the needle through his flesh, his grip on Vivian's hand became almost crushing, but Vivian didn't pull away. She spoke softly to him throughout the procedure, telling him about Phoenix's progress that day, about the new calves in the lower pasture, anything to keep his mind occupied. When Martha finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound, Vaughn was pale and sweating but conscious. "Get him to bed," Martha instructed the men. "He needs rest now." With Hank and Gabriel's help, Vaughn was moved to his bedroom. Once he was settled, Martha shooed everyone out except Vivian. "Someone should sit with him tonight," Martha said. "Make sure fever doesn't set in." She gave Vivian an appraising look. "Think you can handle it?" Vivian nodded, already pulling a chair close to Vaughn's bedside. "I'll call you if anything changes." Martha patted her shoulder. "I know you will. There's fresh water in the pitcher. Try to get him to drink when he wakes." Left alone with Vaughn, Vivian studied his face in the soft lamplight. Even in sleep, lines of pain creased his forehead. Gently, she brushed a strand of dark hair from his brow. "You scared me today," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear. "Don't do that again." To her surprise, Vaughn's eyes fluttered open. "Can't make that promise in this country," he murmured, his voice rough with pain. "But I'll try." Vivian hastily withdrew her hand. "I thought you were asleep." "Half asleep," he admitted. "Enough to hear you." His good hand reached for hers. "Stay with me. I'm not going anywhere," Vivian assured him, twining her fingers with his. Vaughn's eyes held hers for a long moment. "You know, when that bullet hit me, all I could think about was getting back here, to the ranch." He paused. "To you." The simple admission made Vivian's heart race. "Well, you made it," she said softly. "Now you just need to heal." "Vivian," Vaughn began, then hesitated. "There's something I've been wanting to say." "SHH," Vivian interrupted, placing a finger gently against his lips. "Whatever it is, it can wait until you're stronger. Rest now." Vaughn looked like he wanted to argue, but exhaustion and blood loss were taking their toll. His eyes drifted closed, his breathing eventually evening out into sleep. Vivian remained by his side throughout the night, occasionally dampening a cloth to cool his brow or adjusting his blankets. By dawn, she was exhausted but relieved that no fever had developed. Martha found her there when she came to check on Vaughn, still holding his hand even in sleep, her head resting on the edge of the bed. The older woman smiled softly to herself, careful not to wake either of them as she quietly left the room. Vaughn's recovery was slow but steady. The first few days were the hardest, with pain keeping him confined to bed despite his protests. Vivian took over management of the ranch during this time, coordinating with the hands, keeping the books updated, and still finding time to sit with Vaughn in the evenings, reading to him from one of the few books in the house, a collection of Shakespeare's works that had belonged to his mother. By the end of the first week, Vaughn was insisting on getting up, though his left arm remained in a sling. He watched with obvious pride as Vivian confidently gave instructions to the ranch hands, who had come to respect her judgment during his convalescence. "You're a natural at this," he commented as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "At what?" Vivian asked, looking up from the ledger she was reviewing. "Running things. Leading." He gestured toward the ranch with his good hand. "You've kept everything moving forward without missing a step." Vivian closed the ledger, a small smile playing at her lips. I've had a good teacher. Vaughn's eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. Vivian, about what I was trying to say that night, Mr. Daniels. The call from the yard interrupted whatever Vaughn had been about to say. Gabriel rode up to the porch, leading a fine black stallion. That horse trader from Cheyenne just delivered this fellow, said you paid for him last month. Vaughn stood, momentarily distracted by the magnificent animal. Right on time. Bring him to the corral. I want to have a proper look at him. Vivian watched as Vaughn followed Gabriel to inspect the new arrival, the moment between them broken once again. She sighed, wondering if they would ever finish that conversation. As Vaughn's strength returned, they fell back into their familiar routine, though something had shifted subtly between them. There was a new awareness, a tension that hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had, and they'd simply become more conscious of it. Their hands would brush as they passed each other tools in the barn. Their eyes would meet across the dinner table. And sometimes Vivian would look up from her work to find Vaughn watching her with an expression that made her cheeks warm. October gave way to November, bringing the first dusting of snow to the higher elevations. The ranch was as prepared for winter as it could be, with hay stacked high in the barn, the root cellar filled with vegetables, and meat smoking in the smokehouse. It was during the first real snowfall of the season that everything changed. Vivian had been in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare, when the storm hit with unexpected ferocity. By the time she was ready to return to the house, the snow was coming down in blinding sheets, the wind howling around the barn's eaves. She was debating whether to wait out the worst of it when the barn door swung open, admitting a gust of icy air and a snow-covered Vaughn. "Thought I might find you here," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Martha was worried when you didn't come back." "I was just about to brave the storm," Vivian explained. "How bad is it out there?" "Bad enough," Vaughn replied, unwrapping his scarf. "Visibility's down to almost nothing." "We should wait it out here," he glanced at the mare. "How's she doing?" "Restless," Vivian said. "I think she might foal before morning." Vaughn nodded, moving to check the mare himself. "Could be. Her time's about right." He ran a practiced hand over the horse's swollen belly. "Might be good that you're here, then." They settled in to wait out both the storm and the mare's labor, Vaughn building up the small stove in the corner of the barn to ward off the growing chill. The howling wind outside made conversation difficult, so they worked in companionable silence, preparing clean straw for the foaling and ensuring the other animals in the barn were comfortable. As the evening wore on, the mare became increasingly agitated. Vivian stayed close, stroking her neck and speaking soothingly. Vaughn brought blankets and a lantern from the tack room, arranging them to create a comfortable spot where they could keep watch. "Reminds me of my father's stables," Vivian commented as they sat side by side, wrapped in blankets against the cold. "I used to help with foaling season every spring." "You miss it?" Vaughn asked, his shoulder warm against hers. "Parts of it," Vivian admitted. "The horses, certainly. The excitement of new life." She paused. "Not the rest. My father, he changed after my mother died. The gambling, the drinking. By the end, the stables were just another thing for him to lose." Vaughn was quiet for a moment. "I understand loss," he finally said. "When my mother died, my father threw himself into the ranch, working himself to exhaustion every day. I think he was trying to outrun his grief." His voice softened. "When he died too, I was angry for a long time, felt abandoned. What changed?" Vivian asked, touched by his rare openness about his past. Vaughn considered the question. "Time, partly, and realizing that the ranch was his legacy to me, that in building it, maintaining it, he was showing his love in the only way he knew how." He looked around the sturdy barn. "Every post, every board here was placed by his hands or mine working alongside his." The mare nickered softly, drawing their attention. She had lain down in the straw, her sides heaving. "It's starting," Vivian said, moving to kneel beside the laboring animal. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to help the mare through her difficult delivery. When the foal finally emerged, a spindly-legged colt with a white star on his forehead, both Vivian and Vaughn were exhausted but triumphant. "He's beautiful," Vivian whispered as the newborn struggled to stand on wobbly legs, his mother nickering encouragement. Vaughn's arm slipped around her waist as they watched the colt take his first uncertain steps. "Life finds a way," he said softly, "even in the harshest conditions." Vivian leaned into him, suddenly aware of how close they were, how natural it felt to be in his embrace. When she turned her head to look up at him, his face was inches from hers, his eyes reflecting the lantern's golden light. "Vivian," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been trying to find the right moment to say this, but maybe there isn't one, so I'll just say it plain." He took a deep breath. "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, as delicate and momentous as the snowflakes swirling outside. Vivian felt her heart thundering in her chest, a mixture of joy and terror washing over her. "Vaughn, she began, then faltered. How could she explain the complexity of her feelings? The gratitude that had evolved into respect, then affection, and finally something deeper than she had ever experienced. Misinterpreting her hesitation, Vaughn started to pull away. "I understand if you don't feel the same." "I know how we met, the circumstances, no," Vivian interrupted, catching his hand. "That's not it at all." She took a shaky breath. "I'm afraid that I'll wake up tomorrow and this will all be a dream, that I'll be back in that river or worse, that I'll have never met you at all." Vaughn's expression softened. He lifted his free hand to cup her cheek. "This is real, Vivian, I'm real. What I feel for you is the most real thing I've ever known." In the soft glow of the lantern light, with the newborn colt taking his first steps beside them and the storm raging outside, Vivian finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. When they parted, Vaughn's smile was brighter than Vivian had ever seen it. "Marry me," he said, the words more statement than question. Vivian blinked in surprise. "Vaughn, are you certain? It's only been 4 months," he finished for her. 4 months of watching you rebuild your life, 4 months of admiring your strength, your intelligence, your compassion." His hands framed her face. "I've never been more certain of anything." Vivian thought of the river, of the despair that had driven her into its depths. She thought of the strong hands that had pulled her free, of the voice that had declared, "You're done with that." She thought of the months since of finding purpose, community, and finally, unexpectedly, love. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and confident. "Yes, I'll marry you." Vaughn's answering kiss was deeper, more passionate than the first, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily, the storm outside had begun to subside, the howling wind giving way to a peaceful silence. "Look," Vaughn said, nodding toward the barn door where a thin strip of light was visible. "The storm's breaking." "Perfect timing," Vivian replied, smiling as she glanced at the mare and her colt, now resting peacefully in the straw. A new beginning. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Riverton with Martha, the ranch hands, and a few neighbors as witnesses. Vivian wore a simple blue dress, the same one Martha had lent her on her first day at the ranch, now altered to fit her perfectly. Vaughn looked handsome in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Vivian's face throughout the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Vivian thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. How close she had come to missing it all. How a moment of despair had led, through a series of unlikely events, to the greatest joy she had ever known. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn's kiss was a seal on their shared promise not just to love and honor each other, but to face whatever life brought them together, with the same courage and determination that had defined their relationship from its unusual beginning. The winter that followed was harsh, as Wyoming winters often were, but the Daniels ranch endured as it always had. Vivian and Vaughn settled into married life with surprising ease, their partnership strengthening as they faced the challenges of ranch life side by side. By spring, when the snow finally retreated and the first wildflowers began to appear on the hillsides, Vivian had news to share. She told Vaughn as they stood together in the corral, watching Phoenix, now fully trained, proudly showing off her own new foal. "Life does find a way," she said, echoing his words from that snowy night in the barn. She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. Our family is growing. The joy that spread across Vaughn's face was everything Vivian could have hoped for. He lifted her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing. "Careful with my wife," he told himself, setting her gently back on her feet. "She's carrying precious cargo." "Your wife is stronger than she looks," Vivian reminded him with a smile, "but I appreciate the concern." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained since the early days of their relationship, Vaughn wrapped his arm around Vivian's shoulders, pulling her close. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "That day at the river." Vivian considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with regret, though, with gratitude." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "If I hadn't been at that river, if you hadn't been tracking that mountain lion. If I hadn't been so stubborn about pulling you out," Vaughn added with a small smile. "Exactly." Vivian leaned her head against his shoulder. "So many chances for our paths never to cross, yet here we are." "Here we are," Vaughn agreed. His hand moved to rest protectively over her stomach. "The three of us." As twilight deepened into night, bringing out the first stars over the Wyoming plains, Vivian thought about how life could change in an instant, how a decision made in despair could lead, through an unexpected twist of fate, to a happiness greater than she had ever imagined possible. The river had not claimed her that day. Instead, it had carried her to a new shore, a new life, a love that had saved her in ways she was still discovering. And as Vaughn's lips found hers in the gathering darkness, Vivian silently thanked whatever forces had conspired to bring them together: the river, the mountain lion, the cowboy who had refused to let her go, who had pulled her from the depths and declared with quiet certainty, "You're done with that." He had been right, more right than either of them could have known. She was done with despair, done with merely surviving. From that moment on the riverbank to this quiet evening on the porch of what was now their home, Vivian Daniels had been learning what it meant to truly live. And with the promise of new life growing within her, the future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming sky, boundless, challenging, and filled with possibility.